everyone, welcome to another Thursday Tips and Tricks. Today's lesson is border basics. In a couple of our earlier tips and tricks, we talked about piece borders and we talked about mitering corners, but I'm going to address simple two-color border that I'm going to add to a rectangular top and the steps that I go through when I add borders to my project. You may or may not add borders. You may decide that you want to add just 2 borders or 4 borders or 3 borders. That's probably the first decision you need to make. But the next decision is, what fabrics are you going to use? And I always do what I call an audition. I take fabrics that are in consideration and I lay them, I work on the floor for this, and I lay out the 2 or 3 fabrics that I'm thinking about putting on and lay the quilt top over top. And while I'm doing that, I also kind of guesstimate what a good width would be for the borders, a good look while those borders are down there. So I did that with the 2 fabrics for this quilt. This is actually a quilt top that is made from some leftover Rangeley Star blocks, and these are Rangeley Star wall hangings behind me, which is why they're decorating the set today. But I decided I was going to make a narrow 2-inch finished, 2.5-inch strips out of a dark black, and then a nice bright color for the outer border, and I was going to cut those strips 5 inches so they'd finish to about 4.5 inches. So let's get started with how you go about doing the measuring part of that to make the borders fit on your project. First thing, take that quilt center and give it a good press. This has been in a storage tub waiting for this episode, I guess, and there's no way you can get an accurate measurement if the quilt top itself is wrinkled. So give it a real good press, top to bottom, stem to stern, and then you can begin to start the measuring process. Again, I have a nice big floor space that I can spread out most of my quilts there. But if your quilt happens to be too big or too long and you can't measure with the quilt being spread out full, what you're going to want to do is fold the quilt in half. So this one I could lay out, but I didn't. When I measured the longer edge, and I've already added 2 borders here, but when I measured those edges, I took that quilt center and I folded it in half, carefully lined up the edges, and then took my measure and measured from the fold to there. And of course, that twice that measurement is going to be the length that I need to cut. But there's a couple of things that you want to do here as well. One, don't measure just once. I always do at least 3 measurements. Sometimes I'll do 4, sometimes I'll do even more. And I measure at one end, I measure in the middle, I might measure in the middle again, and measure at the other end, and find the average measurement. When I did this one, I measured 4 different times. And the measurements were 60.5 inches the first time, 60 3/8, 60.5, and 60 5/8. And to find the average of those, it's pretty obvious. One's a little under 60.5, one's a little over. So 60.5 was my middle ground, and that was what I cut. But it's a math problem. You add all those numbers up, and if you have 4 measurements, you take that total number and divide it by 4, and that's going to give you your average measurement. And then I cut my borders, narrow borders, added those to the long edges. And that's another thing that I generally do. I generally add the long side borders first, and then the top and bottom borders. And because these are narrow borders, I didn't want to go by about 1 yard and almost 1 3/4 yards to be able to just get the 4 strips that I needed. So I chose to cut these strips going across the width of my fabric so that they were about 40 or 42 inches long, and I pieced them together. I figured I needed about 6, about 1.5 strips for the 2 long sides and about 1.5 strips for the top and bottom. But when I join those strips together to make my border, I do that with an angle seam. And what I actually like to do when I'm doing seamed borders, not just do I do them angled, but I do them one behind the next, behind the next, behind the next, so that I have my seams interspersed at different places all along the border strips. So I cut the first border strip, and then measure the next 60.5 inches and cut the next border strip. And then when I go to cut the shorter border strips, when I do that measurement, remember, it's not just the interior of the quilt. When I go to add those next borders, what I need to measure is the interior of the quilt plus these two borders. And here, make sure that you be consistent. If you measure your quilt top with this, and this is a woodworker's quilting quilt measure your borders with that. If you're measuring with a sewer's tape measure, make sure that when you measure your quilt, you measure your borders with the same tape measure so that the numbers aren't changing, because they do a little bit sometimes. But when I measured, I determined what length I needed. And here's another thing that you're gonna wanna do when you go to add those borders. I always make marks on my borders and marks on my quilt. And I make marks at the halfway mark, at the quarter, and at the 3/4 section of that. And I make those same corresponding marks on my border. And when I go to line these up, then I'll start at the ends. Pin on one end, pin on the other, match my center. This is easy because there's a center seam there. And then match a mark here and match a mark here. And that way, if you need to do any easing, either easing of the border to the quilt top, or usually what happens, you have to ease the quilt top to the border, it becomes very simple to do because you're doing it over the whole length. You're not sewing on and then realizing, oh my goodness, I need to ease in 1/2 inch at the end of the sewing process. So once I add those top and bottom borders, then I would need to repeat the process. To add the 5-inch strip borders, I would need to measure and cut them to length. Now, I did cut these border strips differently than I cut these border strips. When I open this up, you'll notice there are no seams in here. And it made sense to do it that way. I was cutting these 5 inches, so I know I needed 4 strips that were going to be 5 inches, 5 inches, 5 inches, 5 inches. So out of a piece of fabric that's 42 inches wide, 40 or 42 inches wide, I was going to be using 20 inches of that. And that would leave about 20 inches for me to be able to cut my biased binding strips. So it made sense to cut my wider border fabric, the lengthwise thing, and then I don't have any piecing to do on these strips. It also gives a lot of stability to those outside edges when you add those on there. So I'm hoping that this helps you when you go to decide and go to place borders on your project. You know, don't fall into the trap of saying, oh, well, I just sew it on and then whack it off. I hear horror stories from machine quilters all the time that they have received quilts that have an extra inch or 2 inches or 3 inches in the borders because they weren't measured and applied with good skills and with good processes. So I hope this helps. Good luck with all your future borders, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.